"You're no longer welcome in this house," my cowgirl daughter-in-law said the day after my son's funeral. I was expecting family support, but instead found myself thrown out of the Texas ranch my husband and I built from nothing. At 58, I was suddenly homeless, broken, and thought my life was over. But when I opened that safety deposit box my son left me, everything changed. Inside were investment accounts worth thousands and evidence of her lies. 1 week later, I exposed her cruelty to the entire community. Now she's fled Texas in shame, and I'm the richest woman in the county, because she never expected this powerless old woman would have the last word. What would you do if someone stole everything you'd worked for your entire life when they thought you were powerless and broken? I'm about to share exactly how my son Thomas outsmarted his manipulative fiancée from beyond the grave. Tell me in the comments, do you believe justice always finds its way home? The rooster's crow echoed across our Texas spread as the first light painted the eastern sky the color of ripe peaches. I'd been awake for near an hour already, as was my way these 30 years since Patrick passed, watching the sun chase away the shadows from our cattle pens. "Morning, Mama," Thomas called from the barn, though his voice sounded strained, not carrying its usual warm timbre. At 32, my son had grown into the kind of man this harsh Texas land demanded, strong-backed, fair-dealing, and blessed with the O'Sullivan gift for handling both cattle and people. I pulled my shawl tighter and made my way to the chicken coop. "Morning, son. How are the horses faring?" "Right as rain." Thomas emerged from the barn, one hand pressed against his chest, breathing harder than usual. "That new mare's taken well to little Patrick." The kitchen filled with the scent of bacon and fresh biscuits as I prepared breakfast. Through the window, I watched Thomas lean heavily against the fence while talking to our neighbor Maria Delgado. Something wasn't right. "Abuela Rebecca," little Patrick burst through the kitchen door, his 8-year-old energy filling the room. "Papa says we might drive cattle to Fort Worth next month." Thomas stepped inside, his face pale despite the morning's work. "Morning, Mama." He settled at our oak table, the same one Patrick had built our first year here. But I noticed his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his coffee. "Thomas, you look peaked," I said, studying his face with a mother's concern. "Just tired. Helped the Muller boys with their barn raising yesterday." But as he spoke, he pressed his palm flat against his chest again, wincing slightly. Maybe worked harder than I should have, as we bowed heads for morning grace. I watched Thomas struggle to catch his breath. When little Patrick ran outside to feed the chickens, I caught my son's arm. "Son, that's the 3rd time you've touched your chest this morning." Thomas tried to smile, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air. "It's nothing, Mama. Just a little tightness. Probably pulled something lifting those heavy beams." Tightness. My heart began racing. What kind of tightness? Like someone's sitting on my chest sometimes. Comes and goes. He stood slowly, gripping the table edge. "I'm sure it's nothing serious." But as he walked toward the door, Thomas suddenly stopped, his face going gray. His hand flew to his chest, and for a terrifying moment, he couldn't seem to draw breath. "Thomas, I'm fine," he gasped, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the doorframe. Just need some air." I watched my son stumble toward the porch, and a cold dread settled in my bones. In 32 years, I'd never seen Thomas show weakness, never seen him struggle for breath like an old man. Something was terribly wrong with my boy. Sunday morning found us dressed in our finest, riding the wagon to Pastor Heinrich Muller's German Lutheran church in town. Thomas insisted on driving despite my concerns, but I noticed how his hands gripped the reins tighter than usual, his knuckles white against the leather. "Papa, are you feeling poorly?" little Patrick asked, his innocent eyes studying his father's pale complexion. "Just tired, little man," Thomas managed, though sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool September air. The small wooden church was filled with the familiar faces of our community, German immigrants like the Mullers, Irish families like ourselves, and Mexican vaqueros with their families. Pastor Muller's sermon about the parable of the good neighbor resonated through the simple sanctuary, his thick German accent lending weight to every word. I found myself watching Thomas more than listening to the service. He kept shifting in the pew, one hand pressed subtly against his chest, his breathing shallow and labored. When we stood for the final hymn, I had to steady him as he swayed slightly. "Thomas," I whispered, "we should get you home." "I'm fine." "Mama," he insisted. But his voice lacked conviction. After service, the congregation gathered outside for their weekly socializing. Maria Delgado approached with concern etched on her weathered face. "Signora Rebecca, Thomas looks unwell. Perhaps he should see Doc Henderson." "The nearest doctor's a day's ride to Fort Worth," I replied, worry gnawing at my stomach. "And you know how Thomas feels about making a fuss." Vicky Sterling stood near her father's fancy buggy, looking radiant in a blue silk dress that probably cost more than most folks' monthly wages. She'd been courting Thomas for 6 months now, though something about her calculating smile had always set my teeth on edge. "Thomas, darling," she called sweetly. "You look dreadful. Perhaps you've been working too hard on that ranch of yours." Even in his discomfort, Thomas straightened his shoulders. "Just fine, Victoria. Nothing a good Sunday dinner won't cure." But as we prepared to leave, disaster struck. Thomas was helping little Patrick into the wagon when he suddenly doubled over, clutching his chest with both hands. His face went ashen, and a strangled gasp escaped his lips. "Thomas," I cried, rushing to his side. He tried to speak but couldn't catch his breath. The pain in his eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't exhaustion or a pulled muscle. This was something far more serious. Pastor Mueller and several men rushed over as Thomas collapsed to his knees beside the wagon, still fighting for air. "Get him some water," the pastor commanded in his authoritative voice. "No." Thomas gasped, trying to wave everyone away. "I just need a moment." But I could see the fear in his eyes now. The same fear that was clawing at my heart. My strong, capable son, the man who could break horses and handle ornery cattle without breaking a sweat, was struggling to simply breathe. Vicky stood frozen, her face a mask of shock and something else I couldn't quite identify. Was that calculation in her expression? Surely grief and fear were making me imagine things. "We need to get you home," I said firmly, helping Thomas to his feet with the assistance of Heinrich Muller and Maria's eldest son. As we loaded Thomas into the wagon bed, I caught Vicky's eye. Instead of the concern I expected to see, there was something cold and measuring in her gaze. As if she were already making plans. That look chilled me more than Thomas's labored breathing. We barely made it home before Thomas collapsed completely. Maria Delgado helped carry him to his bedroom while I sent little Patrick to stay with the neighbors. With the nearest doctor a full day's ride to Fort Worth, we frontier women learned to tend our own sick with prayer and whatever remedies the good Lord provided. Thomas lay on his bed, his breathing shallow, his skin the color of old parchment. "Mama," he whispered, gripping my hand. "If something happens to me, take care of little Patrick." "You're going to be fine," I said firmly, though my heart was breaking. "You're strong like your father." But Thomas had the same distant gaze Patrick had worn in his final moments, that look of a man already seeing beyond this world. Vicky arrived an hour later, having changed into something more practical. She stood in the doorway, her face composed in what should have been grief, but looked like careful calculation. "How is he?" she asked, making no move to approach the bed. "His heart," I replied, not taking my eyes from my son's face. "Just like his grandfather." Thomas stirred, focusing on Vicky with effort. "Victoria, the ranch papers are in my desk." "Don't talk such nonsense," she said briskly, keeping her distance. You'll be fine. At 2 in the morning, Thomas simply stopped breathing. One moment he was struggling for air. The next there was only terrible silence. Thomas, I whispered, shaking his shoulder. Thomas, wake up. But my boy was gone, taken by the same weak heart that had claimed his grandfather. At 32, Thomas O'Sullivan would never see another sunrise over our Texas ranch. I collapsed beside his bed, 30 years of frontier strength crumbling completely. The sound that came from my throat was the cry of a mother who'd outlived her only child. Rebecca. Vicky's voice cut through my grief like a cold blade. We need to discuss arrangements. I looked up through my tears, hardly believing what I'd heard. Arrangements. The funeral. The ranch. Practical matters. She moved to Thomas's desk and began examining papers with businesslike efficiency. Thomas and I were planning to marry next month. That makes me his intended widow. Victoria, Thomas is barely cold. Which is exactly why we need to plan quickly. She pulled out documents, studying them carefully. The ranch will need managing. I assume you'll want to stay on to help with little Patrick. Stay on in my own home. The home Patrick and I had built from nothing but grief had stolen my fight. I simply nodded, unable to think beyond the fact that my son would never again call me Mama. Good, Vicky said crisply, pocketing what looked like important papers. We'll have the funeral Thursday. I'll handle everything. As she continued making plans with cold efficiency, I remained beside Thomas's bed, wondering how someone could be so calculating while my world had just ended. The woman I'd welcomed into our family was already treating me like hired help in my own home. The next morning brought a steady stream of neighbors offering condolences and help. But Vicky intercepted them all at the front door like a guard dog protecting her territory. I sat in the kitchen, still wearing yesterday's dress, watching through the window as she spoke in hushed tones with Pastor Muller about funeral arrangements. Mrs. O'Sullivan, she kept saying, would have wanted it this way. As if I were already dead and buried alongside my son. Maria Delgado managed to slip past Vicky's watchful eye, finding me staring at Thomas's empty coffee cup still sitting on the table. Rebecca, she whispered, pulling me into her arms. I am so sorry. Mi amiga. I can't seem to make it real. I confessed, my voice barely audible. Keep expecting him to walk through that door asking for breakfast. The grief. It takes time, Maria said gently. But you are strong. You will survive this. Before I could respond, Vicky appeared in the doorway. Maria, how thoughtful of you to visit. Rebecca needs her rest now. The dismissal was polite but firm. Maria squeezed my hand and whispered, if you need anything at all, you send little Patrick to find me. After Maria left, Vicky settled across from me at the table with a ledger book and several official-looking papers. We need to discuss practical matters. Rebecca, the funeral will cost money. And the ranch has expenses? Thomas handled all that, I said numbly. I don't know about such things. Exactly. Vicky's smile was sympathetic, but her eyes were calculating. Which is why I've taken the liberty of reviewing his papers. As his intended bride, I feel responsible for settling his affairs properly. She spread documents across the table, bank statements, property deeds, papers I'd never seen before. The good news is the ranch is profitable. The cattle alone are worth considerable money. But there are debts, taxes, operating costs. My head spun trying to follow her explanations. Numbers had never been my strength. That was Patrick's domain. Then Thomas's. What does it mean? It means you don't need to worry about such complicated matters, Vicky said soothingly. I'll handle everything. You can focus on grieving and caring for little Patrick. Something in her tone made me look up sharply. Handle everything. The business side of things. The ranch operations? The finances? The legal matters? She gathered the papers protectively. Thomas would have wanted his family taken care of. And as the woman he intended to marry, I consider that my responsibility now. But this is my home, I said quietly, confusion mixing with the first stirring of alarm. Patrick and I built this place from nothing. Vicky's expression softened with what looked like pity. Of course it is, dear, and you're welcome to stay as long as you're helpful. But legally speaking, the property passed to Thomas when Patrick died? And now? She let the sentence hang unfinished. The implication hit me like a physical blow. In my grief-addled state, I hadn't considered the legal reality. The ranch that Patrick and I had carved from wild Texas land, that we'd defended against drought and rustlers and heartbreak, now belonged to a woman who'd known my son for less than a year. I need some air, I whispered, standing on shaking legs. As I stepped onto the porch that Patrick had built with his own hands, I heard Vicky behind me, already making plans with someone about managing the transition efficiently. My son wasn't even buried yet, and I was already becoming a stranger in my own home. Thursday morning dawned gray and cold, fitting weather for laying my boy to rest. The entire community gathered at Pastor Muller's church, their faces solemn with genuine grief for Thomas, who'd been respected by every soul in the county. I sat in the front pew holding little Patrick's small hand, watching Vicky play the part of grieving widow with theatrical precision. She wore black silk that must have cost a fortune, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief while accepting condolences from neighbors who praised her strength in this difficult time. Such a devoted couple. I heard Mrs. Henderson whisper to her husband, "Poor Victoria, losing her intended husband so young." The irony cut deep. These good people, my friends and neighbors for 30 years, were offering their sympathy to a woman who'd known Thomas less than 1 year, while treating me like a distant relative. Pastor Muller delivered a beautiful eulogy about Thomas's character, his dedication to the land, his love for family. But even as he spoke, I noticed Vicky checking a small gold watch, as if she had appointments to keep, at the graveside. As we lowered my son into Texas soil beside his father, Vicky stood perfectly composed while I wept openly. Little Patrick clung to my skirts, confused by the finality of it all. "Abuela Rebecca," he whispered. "When is Papa coming home?" The question broke what remained of my heart. "He's not coming home. Sweetheart, Papa's with your grandfather now, watching over us from heaven." After the burial, the community gathered at our ranch for the traditional meal. Women brought casseroles and pies. Men spoke quietly about Thomas's skill with cattle, and children played in the yard as if life could somehow continue normally. I moved through my own kitchen like a ghost, accepting hugs and kind words, but feeling utterly alone despite the crowd. Vicky held court in the parlor, graciously accepting offers of help and support as if she were the lady of the house, which, I realized with growing dread, she now was. As the last neighbor departed, Vicky closed the front door with a decisive click and turned to face me. The mask of grief disappeared completely, replaced by cold calculation. "Rebecca, we need to talk." Something in her tone made little Patrick look up from his toy soldiers. I sent him to his room, sensing what was coming. "I've been patient out of respect for the mourning period," Vicky began, settling into Thomas's favorite chair as if she belonged there. "But we need to discuss your situation." "My situation." "This arrangement isn't working. I need privacy to grieve properly. And frankly, having you here is complicated." She smoothed her expensive dress. "I've decided you should find other accommodations." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Other accommodations, Victoria? This is my home." "Was your home?" she corrected coolly. "Thomas inherited it when Patrick died, and now it's mine. I'm sorry if that's difficult to understand." But legal reality doesn't change based on sentiment. I stared at this woman I'd welcomed into our family, hardly believing what I was hearing. You want me to leave today? We just buried Thomas this morning. I know it seems harsh, but prolonging this will only make it harder. Vicky stood, smoothing her skirts. I'll give you until tomorrow evening to pack your things. That should be sufficient time. As she walked toward the stairs, she paused. Oh, and Rebecca, don't make this more difficult than necessary. Thomas wouldn't want unpleasantness. Alone in the parlor where I'd rocked Thomas as a baby, where Patrick had proposed 35 years ago, I finally understood the full scope of Vicky's calculation. She hadn't just stolen my son's heart. She'd stolen my entire life. I spent that terrible night packing 35 years of memories into whatever containers I could find. My wedding dress, Patrick's Bible, Thomas's childhood drawings, a lifetime reduced to what would fit in our old farm wagon. Little Patrick helped silently, his 8-year-old mind struggling to understand why we were leaving the only home he'd ever known. Are we going on an adventure? Abuela Rebecca, he asked, trying to be brave. Something like that. Sweetheart, I managed, though my heart was breaking with every item I wrapped in old quilts. Vicky appeared in the doorway at dawn, already dressed and composed. I trust you're nearly finished. Nearly, I said, not trusting myself to say more. Good. I've arranged for the Hendersons to take little Patrick until you're settled somewhere. She spoke as if discussing livestock arrangements. Patrick stays with me, I said firmly, finding strength I didn't know I still possessed. For the first time, Vicky looked genuinely surprised. Rebecca, be reasonable. You have nowhere to go, no means of support. The boy needs stability. The boy needs his family. I lifted my chin, channeling every bit of Irish stubbornness my mother had passed down. Patrick comes with me. Something flickered in Vicky's eyes, respect, perhaps, or annoyance that I wasn't crumbling completely. Suit yourself, but don't come crying to me when reality sets in. Maria Delgado appeared with her wagon just as I finished loading mine. Where will you go? Mi amiga, she asked quietly. The boarding house in town, I suppose, until I can figure out something more permanent. The words tasted like ashes. At 58, I was starting over with nothing but the clothes on my back and a confused little boy depending on me. This is wrong, Maria said, watching Vicky supervise our departure from the front porch. Thomas would be ashamed of such treatment. Thomas is dead, I replied, the words still foreign on my tongue. And the dead don't get to choose how the living behave. The ride to town felt like a funeral procession. Little Patrick sat beside me on the wagon seat, his small hand in mine, watching the only home he'd ever known disappear behind us. I didn't look back, couldn't bear to see Vicky standing victorious on the porch Patrick had built with his own hands. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house sat on the edge of town, a weathered 2-story building that housed drifters, traveling salesmen, and now, apparently, displaced widows. The room she showed us was barely large enough for a bed and washstand, but it was clean and the price was within my meager means. How long will you be staying, Mrs.? Patterson asked kindly. I'm not sure, I admitted, until I can find work, I suppose. That afternoon, as I sat on the narrow bed watching little Patrick play with his toy soldiers on the floor, someone knocked on our door. A young man in a clean suit stood in the hallway, hat in hand. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I'm James Morrison, from Morrison and Associates. I handled your son's legal affairs. My heart stuttered. Legal affairs. I'm calling to inform you that there will be a formal reading of Thomas's will next Tuesday at 2 o'clock in my office. Your presence is required. I stared at him, confused. Required, but Victoria said, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Mr. Morrison interrupted gently. I can only tell you what Thomas's will specifies. It specifically names you as a beneficiary. After he left, I sat in that tiny room holding the official notice, feeling the first stirring of something I'd thought was dead hope. Thomas had left me something after all. Maybe, just maybe, my boy had found a way to take care of his mother even from the grave. Tuesday arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the Texas sun itself was encouraging me to face whatever Thomas had planned. I dressed in my best black dress, the same one I'd worn to Patrick's funeral, and walked the dusty main street to Morrison and Associates with little Patrick's hand firmly in mine. The law office occupied the second floor above the general store, its windows overlooking the bustling street where cowboys and merchants conducted their daily business. Mr. Morrison greeted us with professional courtesy, though I caught sympathy in his kind eyes. Vicky arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, wearing a burgundy dress that probably cost more than most folks earned in a month. She'd brought a man I didn't recognize, sharp-faced and calculating, with the look of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. My brother Marcus, Vicky explained coolly. He handles my business affairs. Marcus nodded curtly in my direction before taking out a leather portfolio and gold pen, clearly expecting to document Vicky's inheritance for tax purposes. Mr. Morrison settled behind his desk and opened Thomas's file. Ladies, gentlemen, I know this is difficult, but Thomas was very specific about his wishes. I'll read the will in its entirety. The first part proceeded exactly as Vicky expected. The ranch, the cattle, Thomas's small savings account, all left to my intended bride, Victoria Sterling. She nodded approvingly with each item, occasionally glancing at me with something resembling pity. Then Mr. Morrison's voice changed, taking on a more formal tone. However, there is one additional provision that Thomas added just 2 months before his death. The atmosphere shifted. Vicky stopped nodding and leaned forward, her confident expression flickering with sudden attention. To my mother, Rebecca O'Sullivan, who provided the funds for our ranch down payment and has never asked for repayment. I leave the contents of safety deposit box number 47 at First National Bank, along with all associated documentation and account information contained therein. What safety deposit box? Vicky's voice cut through the room like a whip crack. Thomas never mentioned any safety deposit box. Mr. Morrison looked up from the document. Apparently, it was something he maintained privately. He was quite specific that the contents should go to his mother upon his death. I was as surprised as Vicky, but for different reasons. Thomas had never mentioned a safety deposit box to me either. What could he possibly have put there? Marcus leaned forward aggressively. What's in this box if there's anything of significant value? It should be part of the estate. I have no knowledge of the contents. Mr. Morrison replied calmly. Thomas simply provided the bank information and instructions that Mrs. O'Sullivan should have full access upon presentation of the death certificate. Vicky's face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. Thomas was my intended husband. Anything he owned should rightfully be mine. The provision is very clear and legally binding. Mr. Morrison said mildly. Thomas was completely competent when he made this addition. I witnessed the document myself. When exactly did he add this? I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Morrison consulted his notes. July 15th. He came in specifically to make this addition to his existing will. July 15th. I remembered that date because it was the day after Thomas had seemed unusually quiet during Sunday dinner. Vicky had been complaining about something, the heat, I think, and Thomas had barely spoken throughout the meal. This is a waste of everyone's time, Vicky snapped, standing abruptly. Marcus, we need to file a challenge immediately. Actually, Mr. Morrison said, reaching for another envelope. Before you leave, I have specific instructions from Thomas regarding the safety deposit box access. He handed me a sealed envelope containing bank documents and a small brass key. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Thomas wanted you to access the box within the next few days. The bank will need to verify the death certificate and process the paperwork, but this should expedite matters. Vicky's eyes fixed on the key in my trembling hands like a hawk watching a mouse. I'm coming with you to the bank. I'm afraid that's not possible, Mr. Morrison interjected. The safety deposit box access is restricted to Mrs. O'Sullivan only. Bank policy. As we filed out of the office, I could feel Vicky's fury radiating like heat from a forge. In the hallway, she cornered me. Rebecca, let's be reasonable. Whatever Thomas left you, we should share it. He would have wanted his intended wife to benefit. For the first time since Thomas's death, I almost smiled. You made it very clear that you don't believe Thomas would have left me anything valuable. Now, suddenly you're concerned about sharing. Her mask slipped completely, revealing the calculating woman beneath. Don't forget, you're living in a boarding house. You need my goodwill. I looked at this woman who'd stolen my home and tried to steal my dignity. Actually, Victoria, I don't think I need anything from you at all. Walking away from her shocked expression, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks, the stirring of hope that maybe, just maybe, my son had found a way to protect his mother even from the grave. 3 days later, after the bank completed their paperwork, I stood before safety deposit box number 47 at First National Bank with trembling hands. The bank manager, Mr. Peterson, had been expecting me and offered his condolences while escorting little Patrick and me to the vault area. Box 47 is one of our larger units, he explained as we walked through the heavy security doors. Your son rented it about 3 years ago and visited quite regularly. Always very private about his business. 3 years Thomas had been planning something for 3 years. And I'd never suspected. Mister? Peterson used his master key while I inserted Thomas's brass key, and the long metal box slid out smoothly. It was indeed large, about the size of a small trunk, and surprisingly heavy. Take all the time you need, Mrs. O'Sullivan, Mr. Peterson said, showing us to a private viewing room. I'll be at my desk when you're finished. Alone in the small, windowless room with little Patrick beside me, I lifted the lid of the safety deposit box. The first thing I saw was a letter addressed to me in Thomas's familiar handwriting, sealed with red wax. My hands shook as I broke the seal and unfolded the pages. Mama, it began. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Victoria has probably shown you exactly who she really is. I'm sorry for that. But I'm not surprised. I've known for months what kind of person I was planning to marry, and I've been preparing for this possibility. My heart raced as I continued reading. Little Patrick quietly playing with his toy horse beside me. You gave us $800 for our ranch down payment 3 years ago. I know you thought of it as a loan, even though you never asked for repayment. I've been investing that money carefully, adding to it whenever possible. The money in the accompanying accounts isn't just repayment. Mama, it's what careful investing and cattle profits have grown into. I set the letter down with shaking hands and looked at the documents underneath. Bank statements, investment certificates, account numbers. My eyes scanned the balance sheets, trying to make sense of the figures. Multiple accounts at different banks, investment certificates from cattle speculation, even shares in a railroad expansion project. The total made me gasp aloud. Over $3,000, more money than I'd seen in my entire lifetime. I picked up Thomas's letter again, hardly believing what I was reading. I also discovered that Victoria has been telling people you contribute nothing to our household expenses. What she doesn't mention is that our mortgage payments come directly from the cattle profits that exist because of your initial investment. Every dollar you've given us for household expenses went straight into these investment accounts. The letter continued, and my vision blurred with tears. I've been documenting everything. Mama, every conversation, every cruel comment she's made about you when she thought I wasn't listening. It's all in the folder marked evidence. I thought you should know what kind of person has been living in our house. I reached for the thick folder he'd mentioned. Inside were handwritten notes, copies of conversations, even receipts showing Vicky's extravagant spending on clothes and jewelry while complaining about household expenses. Years of careful documentation, all in Thomas's methodical handwriting. Abuela Rebecca, little Patrick said softly. Why are you crying? Happy tears. Sweetheart, I managed. Wiping my eyes. Your papa left us a very special gift. The final paragraph of Thomas's letter made my heart swell with pride and love. You deserve so much better than the way she's treated you. Mama, take this money and build yourself a life where no one can make you feel unwanted ever again. Buy yourself a little house in town, or travel to see Aunt Margaret in California if you want. You've spent your whole life taking care of others. Now it's time to take care of yourself. I sat in that little room for nearly an hour, reading through everything Thomas had left for me. Investment strategies, bank contacts, even a letter of introduction to a lawyer in Austin who specialized in women's property rights. By the time I emerged from the vault, I had a clear picture of exactly how my son had spent his final years, not just planning his own future, but ensuring his mother would never be at anyone's mercy again. Mr. Peterson helped me arrange to transfer the investment documents to a secure envelope and explain the process for accessing the various accounts. As I walked back to the boarding house, little Patrick skipping beside me, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Patrick died: complete financial security. More than that, I felt the profound love of a son who had seen his mother's vulnerability and quietly, methodically, built her a fortress of independence. Thomas had taken care of me after all, just like he'd always promised he would, armed with Thomas's evidence and the security of financial independence. I returned to the ranch 3 days later with a purpose that burned steady and sure in my chest. I dressed in my finest black dress, not the mourning garb of a pitiful widow, but the dignified attire of a woman of means who'd come to settle accounts. Little Patrick walked beside me up the familiar path, his small hand in mine, sensing the importance of this moment without fully understanding it. The ranch looked exactly as it had when Patrick and I first built it from raw Texas earth, but now I saw it with different eyes, not as a lost home, but as a chapter of my life that was finally ready to close properly. Vicky answered my knock wearing a lavish blue silk dress that probably cost more than most families earned in 3 months. Her face immediately darkened when she saw me, but I noticed something else in her expression now, a flicker of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Rebecca, what are you doing here? Her voice carried less authority than it had during our previous encounters. I came to discuss some business matters that have recently come to light, I said calmly, holding up Thomas's leather portfolio. I believe you'll find them quite interesting. She hesitated, clearly wanting to refuse me entry. But Pastor Muller's voice carried from the parlor, along with those of Maria Delgado and several other neighbors. Sunday afternoon social calls were a tradition in our community, and turning away the grieving mother would raise uncomfortable questions. Of course, she said through gritted teeth, stepping aside, though I can't imagine what business we might have. I walked into the parlor where I'd rocked Thomas as a baby, where Patrick had proposed 35 years ago, where we'd celebrated countless Christmases and weathered every storm life had thrown at us. The assembled neighbors greeted me with warm sympathy, their genuine concern a stark contrast to Vicky's barely concealed hostility. Mrs. O'Sullivan, how are you managing in town? Asked Mrs. Henderson, her kind eyes filled with worry. We've all been concerned about your circumstances. That's very thoughtful, I replied, settling into Patrick's old chair with a confidence that clearly surprised Vicky. Actually, my circumstances have improved considerably since Thomas's will reading, Something in my tone made the room grow quieter, conversation trailing off as people sensed undercurrents they didn't understand. The will reading revealed some fascinating documents, I continued, opening Thomas's portfolio with deliberate care. It seems my son was quite thorough in his record-keeping, especially regarding household finances and, personal observations. Vicky's face went pale. Rebecca, I don't think this is appropriate for social conversation. On the contrary, I think it's very appropriate. I withdrew one of Thomas's handwritten notes, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room. For instance, this record from last Christmas, where Thomas documented a conversation between Victoria and her sister about turning my bedroom into a sewing room once the old bat finally moves out. Pastor Muller's wife gasped audibly. Maria Delgado's eyes flashed with the fire of righteous anger. The other neighbors exchanged shocked glances, beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple family disagreement. That's taken completely out of context, Vicky stammered, her composure starting to crack. Private conversations between family members? Family members? I raised an eyebrow, pulling out another document. Is that how family members discuss each other? Because this notation from March records you telling your brother that I was a burden who contributes nothing but expects to be housed and fed like family. The silence in the room was profound. These good people, who'd known me for decades, were hearing for the first time how I'd been discussed in private by the woman they'd pitied as a grieving widow. There's more, I said, my voice gaining strength with each revelation. This financial record shows that our mortgage payments have been automatically deducted from Thomas's cattle profits for the entire 3 years I've lived here. Every month. Without fail. While you told everyone I was a financial burden on your household. Mrs. Henderson's face darkened with indignation. Victoria, is this true? You've been saying Rebecca was dependent on your charity while she was actually contributing to the household expenses? It's more complicated than that, Vicky said desperately, but her voice lacked conviction. There were other expenses, other considerations, such as these. I pulled out receipts for luxury purchases, silk dresses, expensive jewelry, trips to Fort Worth for shopping excursions, all bought on the same days you told Thomas we couldn't afford basic household necessities. Pastor Muller cleared his throat, his usually gentle voice carrying stern disapproval. Mrs. Sterling, these are very serious accusations being made. They're not accusations, I said firmly. They're documented facts, recorded by my son who apparently saw through the deception long before I did. I reached into the portfolio one final time and withdrew the bank statements showing Thomas's investment accounts. The numbers were clear enough for everyone to read, even from across the room. You see, Victoria has been operating under a fundamental misunderstanding. She believed Thomas left me nothing of value, that I was completely dependent on her goodwill. I let my eyes meet hers directly. But my son was far more thoughtful than either of us gave him credit for. Vicky's eyes fixed on the bank statements like a cornered animal watching a trap close around her. What? What are those papers? The $800 I provided for your ranch down payment 3 years ago, Thomas invested it carefully, adding to it regularly, along with detailed documentation of every cruel comment, every manipulation, every lie you told about my contributions to this household. I stood slowly, feeling the power of truth behind me. He was protecting his mother from a woman he'd come to understand completely. The transformation in the room was immediate and dramatic, where moments before I'd been seen as a displaced, pitiful widow. I was now revealed as a woman of means who'd been shamefully mistreated by someone they'd all pitied and supported. Maria Delgado stood up, her face dark with anger. Signora Victoria, you should be ashamed to treat an elder this way. A woman who gave you her life savings. How much? Pastor Muller asked quietly. his voice heavy with disappointment. How much did Thomas manage to accumulate through his investments? I looked directly at Vicky as I answered. Enough to ensure I'll never again be dependent on anyone's charity. Enough to buy my own home, to live comfortably for the rest of my days, and to help little Patrick with his education when the time comes. The woman who'd thrown me out the day after my son's funeral now sat frozen in her expensive dress, watching her carefully constructed world crumble around her as the truth finally came to light. The silence stretched like a taut rope until Pastor Muller finally spoke, his voice heavy with disappointment. Mrs. Sterling, I think you owe Mrs. O'Sullivan an explanation. Vicky's composure crumbled like a house of cards in a Texas windstorm. You don't understand the pressures I was under. Everyone expected me to be perfect, to manage everything perfectly. So you threw out the woman who raised the man you claimed to love. Maria Delgado's voice cut through the room like a blade. The day after his funeral, I needed space to grieve. Vicky's voice rose desperately. She was always there, always watching, always judging. I was cooking your meals and mending your clothes, I said quietly. I was caring for the grandson you've now tried to separate from his only remaining family. Mrs. Muller stood up, her German accent thick with indignation. This is shameful behavior. In the old country, we would never treat an elder this way. The old country doesn't matter here, Vicky snapped, her mask completely gone now. This is Texas. People make their own way or they get left behind. The words hung in the air like a curse, revealing exactly the kind of person she truly was. Pastor Muller's face darkened with genuine anger, the first time I'd ever seen the gentleman lose his composure. Mrs. Sterling, he said slowly. I believe you've said quite enough. But Vicky wasn't finished destroying herself. Desperation made her reckless. You all act so righteous. But where were you when I was struggling to manage a ranch and plan a wedding and deal with a difficult old woman who never knew when she wasn't wanted? Difficult. I pulled out another of Thomas's documents. Is that what you call a woman who gave you $800 for your down payment and never asked for repayment? Vicky's face went white. She'd clearly forgotten about the money in her panic. $800, Pastor Muller repeated, his eyebrows rising. That's more than most families see in 2 years. Money that Thomas invested carefully, I continued, growing it into enough to ensure I'd never be dependent on anyone's charity again, including yours, Victoria. The room erupted in murmurs of shock and approval. These frontier people understood the value of money, the sacrifice represented by such a sum. That's impossible, Vicky whispered. You're living in a boarding house. By choice, I said firmly. While I decide what to do with my independence, perhaps I'll buy a little house in town. Perhaps I'll visit my sister in California. Perhaps I'll even travel back to Ireland to see the land my parents left behind. The transformation in the room was remarkable. Where moments before I'd been seen as a pitiful displaced widow, I was now viewed as a woman of means who'd been shamefully mistreated. Maria Delgado moved to stand beside my chair, her hand on my shoulder in a gesture of support. Rebecca, you will always have friends here. Always. Indeed she will, Pastor Muller agreed solemnly. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I hope you know that our community deeply regrets how you've been treated. Vicky looked around the room desperately, seeing her social standing crumbling before her eyes. In a frontier community, reputation was everything, and hers was now in ruins. I want you all to leave, she said suddenly, her voice shrill. This is my house, and I want you out. Actually, I said, standing slowly, I think we'll be going anyway. I've said what I came to say. As we filed toward the door, Vicky made one last desperate attempt. Rebecca, wait. We can work this out. We're family. I paused in the doorway and looked back at this woman who'd tried to steal not just my home, but my dignity. Victoria, You made it very clear that we were never family. You were simply a woman who wanted what my son could provide. Pastor Muller was the last to leave, and I heard him say quietly to Vicky, I suggest you spend some time in prayer. Mrs. Sterling, you have much to answer for. Outside in the afternoon sunshine, our little group gathered around me like a protective circle. These good people, my true neighbors and friends, had seen the truth and chosen justice over politeness. Rebecca, Pastor Muller said gently, you will always have a place in our community. Always. As we walked away from the ranch house, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Patrick died, the solid foundation of community support beneath my feet. Thomas had given me financial independence, but these good people had given me something equally valuable, the knowledge that I was truly home. 3 months later, I stood on the front porch of my new house on Elm Street, watching little Patrick chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. The modest 2-bedroom home sat just 4 blocks from the church, close enough to walk to Sunday services, but far enough from the ranch to represent a completely fresh start. Thomas's investments had allowed me to purchase the house outright, with enough remaining to live comfortably for years to come. More importantly, his documentation had given me something I'd thought was lost forever, my reputation and standing in the community. The transformation had been remarkable. Where once I'd been seen as the pitiful, displaced mother-in-law, I was now viewed as a woman of substance who'd been shamefully wronged. Neighbors stopped by regularly with fresh bread or garden vegetables. Not out of charity, but out of genuine friendship and respect. Maria Delgado had become a daily visitor, often bringing her sewing to work on my front porch while we discussed everything from cattle prices to the latest gossip from town. This afternoon, she'd brought news that made my heart both heavy and satisfied. Victoria Sterling left on yesterday's stage, she reported, settling into the rocking chair beside mine. Packed up and gone. Just like that. Where did she go? I asked, though I wasn't sure I truly cared. Back east somewhere. Her brother came with a wagon and loaded everything valuable from the ranch house. Word is they're selling the property to pay debts. I watched little Patrick catch a particularly large firefly and hold it gently in his cupped hands, marveling at its light before releasing it back into the evening air. What about the ranch itself? The Hendersons made an offer. Fair price, from what I hear. They'll take good care of the land. Maria's voice carried satisfaction. Justice has a way of working itself out, doesn't it? Indeed it did. In the months since our confrontation, Victoria's reputation had crumbled completely. Invitations stopped coming, social calls ceased, and the ladies' auxiliary had quietly removed her from their membership rolls. In a frontier community where reputation was everything, she'd become a pariah. Pastor Muller appeared at my gate, his weekly visit as regular as clockwork. He'd taken it upon himself to check on my welfare, though we both knew it was more friendship than pastoral duty at this point. Good evening, Rebecca. How are you settling in? Very well, thank you. Pastor, would you like some coffee? I just brewed a fresh pot. As I served coffee on my own front porch, using china that had been my mother's, I reflected on how much had changed. 6 months ago, I'd been a displaced widow living on someone else's charity. Now I was an independent woman with my own home, my own income, and the respect of my community. I received a letter from my sister Margaret in California. I told my friends as we settled into comfortable conversation. She's invited little Patrick and me to visit next spring. California, Maria's eyes widened. That's quite an adventure for a Texas woman. Thomas always said I should see more of the world. I smiled, remembering my son's dreams for my future. He used to talk about taking me to San Francisco someday, to see the ocean. Pastor Muller nodded approvingly. Travel broadens the mind and enriches the soul. Thomas would be proud to know you're embracing new experiences. Little Patrick ran up to the porch, his face flushed with excitement from chasing fireflies. Abuela Rebecca, can we really go see Aunt Margaret? Can we ride on a train? We can indeed, sweetheart. Would you like that? His enthusiastic nod made all three adults smile. This child, who'd lost his father so young, was resilient in the way that children can be. He'd adapted to our new life with remarkable grace, making friends in the neighborhood and excelling at the town school. You know, I said thoughtfully, Thomas left me more than money. He left me proof that even when people try to diminish you, the truth has a way of surfacing. Wisdom earned through hardship, Pastor Muller observed. The most valuable kind. As the evening deepened and my friends prepared to leave, I found myself thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this place. 6 months ago, I'd thought my life was over. I'd been a woman defined by her relationships to others, Patrick's wife, Thomas's mother, Victoria's burden. Now I was simply Rebecca O'Sullivan, a woman of independent means and strong character who'd survived betrayal and emerged stronger for it. Abuela Rebecca, little Patrick said as I tucked him into his bed in our new home. I'm glad we live here now. It feels safe. It is safe. Sweetheart, we're exactly where we belong. Later that night, sitting alone on my front porch with a cup of tea, I looked up at the Texas stars and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Thomas had given me more than financial security. He'd given me the tools to reclaim my dignity and build a new life on my own terms. Sometimes the greatest gift a child can give a parent isn't protection from life's hardships, but the strength to overcome them with grace. My son had taught me that even in death, love finds a way to provide exactly what's needed most. And in my case, what I'd needed most was the chance to discover that Rebecca O'Sullivan was stronger than she'd ever imagined. 1 year later, I stood in my garden on a crisp October morning, watching little Patrick help Maria's grandson plant winter vegetables while the older boy taught him the Spanish names for each seed. The sight filled my heart with contentment. This was what Thomas had envisioned when he'd planned my future so carefully. The anniversary of his death had passed quietly, marked not with grief, but with gratitude for the gift he'd given me the chance to discover my own strength. The entire community had gathered at his graveside, not just to remember Thomas, but to celebrate the justice his foresight had made possible. Pastor Muller approached through my garden gate, carrying a letter that bore the official seal of the county courthouse. Rebecca, this came for you on today's stage. I wiped my hands on my apron and accepted the envelope with curiosity. Inside was a formal document that made me gasp with surprise. What is it, mi amiga? Maria asked, looking up from where she was teaching the boys to plant carrots. It's from the railroad company, I said, hardly believing what I was reading. They're offering to purchase the right-of-way through the old Henderson property, the land that used to be our ranch. The compensation they're offering. I had to sit down on my garden bench. It's more than the entire ranch was worth. Dios mío, Maria breathed. Thomas's investment in railroad stocks. He knew, I whispered, understanding flooding through me. Somehow, he knew the railroad would come through that exact area. That's why he documented everything so carefully. Why he made sure I'd have the evidence to expose Victoria's lies. He wanted to ensure that when this opportunity came, I'd be in a position to benefit from it. Pastor Muller shook his head in amazement. That young man was thinking 3 steps ahead, even facing his own mortality. The letter explained that as the original investor in the ranch's down payment, and with Thomas's documented proof of my financial contribution, I was entitled to a percentage of any profits from the land sale. The amount was staggering, enough to secure not just my future, but little Patrick's education and inheritance as well. That evening, the entire community gathered in my parlor for what had become our weekly social hour. Word of the railroad windfall had spread quickly, and everyone wanted to hear the details. But, more than that, they wanted to celebrate what had become a local legend, the story of how Thomas O'Sullivan had protected his mother from beyond the grave. It's like something from a dime novel, laughed Mrs. Henderson, whose family had prospered from purchasing the ranch at a fair price. The good son, the scheming woman, the hidden treasure, and justice served with interest. Not hidden treasure, I corrected gently. Careful planning and a mother's love repaid with a son's wisdom. Little Patrick, now 9 and tall for his age, sat at my feet playing with wooden horses that the town carpenter had carved for him. He looked up with serious eyes that reminded me so much of Thomas at that age. Abuela Rebecca, will you tell the story again about how Papa took care of us? The room grew quiet, as it always did when I shared this tale. It had become something of a tradition, this retelling of how justice had prevailed through patience and preparation. Your papa was a very wise man, I began, settling back in my rocking chair. He understood that sometimes people show their true nature only when they think no one is watching. So he watched, and he documented, and he prepared. Like a detective, piped up one of the neighbor children. Exactly like a detective, but more than that, he was a son who understood that the greatest gift you can give someone you love isn't protection from hardship, but the tools to overcome it with dignity. Maria nodded approvingly. In my culture, we say that the dead continue to care for the living through the wisdom they leave behind. Thomas left you more than money. Rebecca, he left you proof of your own worth. Pastor Mueller leaned forward in his chair. There's a lesson in this story for all of us. Evil may triumph temporarily, but truth has a way of surfacing when it's most needed. And sometimes, justice comes not through revenge, but through the patient accumulation of evidence and the courage to stand up for what's right. What happened to the bad lady? Asked little Patrick. She learned that actions have consequences, I said carefully. And that treating people with cruelty ultimately leaves you alone and unwelcome in any decent community. I'd heard through various channels that Victoria had struggled to establish herself back east. Her reputation had somehow followed her, perhaps through her brother's business connections. Or simply because frontier communities had their own networks of communication. She'd found herself unwelcome in the social circles she'd hoped to join, her past behavior making her unsuitable company for respectable families. The important thing, I continued, is not what happened to her, but what we learned from the experience. We learned that community matters, that reputation is built through consistent good behavior, and that family loyalty runs deeper than romantic attachment. As the evening wound down and neighbors began heading home, I found myself standing on my front porch once again, looking up at the Texas stars that had witnessed so much change in my life. The railroad money would allow me to do things I'd never dreamed possible. I could travel to California to visit Margaret, perhaps even take that trip to Ireland to see the land my parents had left behind. I could ensure little Patrick received the finest education available, maybe even send him to university back east if he showed the inclination. But more than the money, Thomas had given me something invaluable, the knowledge that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. That even at 58, even after losing everything I'd thought defined me, I could rebuild and thrive. Thank you, son, I whispered to the night air, for seeing what I couldn't see in myself, and for loving me enough to make sure I'd discover it when I needed it most. A gentle breeze rustled through my garden, carrying the scent of the roses I'd planted along the fence, the same variety that had grown beside the ranch house where Thomas had played as a boy. Some things endure, I thought. Love endures. Wisdom endures. Justice, though it may take time, endures. And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, we discover that we're stronger than we ever dared to dream. In the distance, I could hear the whistle of the evening train, carrying travelers toward new adventures and fresh starts. Soon, little Patrick and I would board one of those trains ourselves, heading west toward the ocean Thomas had always wanted me to see. But we'd always come back to this little house on Elm Street, to this community that had embraced us when we needed it most, to this place where I'd learned that home isn't just where you're born or where you've lived the longest. Home is where people know your true worth and stand with you when it matters most. And in that respect, I was the richest woman in all of Texas.